Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one trying the hardest not to prove it. The bass from the speakers rattled the glass doors as laughter spilled across the backyard of the Mitchell estate. Colored lights danced across the swimming pool, turning the water into a shifting mix of blue, purple, and gold. More than 100 teenagers crowded the property, their voices blending into the warm North Carolina summer night. Expensive cars lined the circular driveway. Music echoed through the trees beyond the fence. It was the kind of party people talked about for weeks. And it was the kind of place Elijah Carter never would have chosen to be. The 18-year-old stepped through the side gate carrying a small paper pharmacy bag tucked under one arm. His gray hoodie looked plain compared to the designer clothes surrounding him. His sneakers were clean but worn. His eyes stayed low as he crossed the patio, moving carefully between groups of students who barely noticed him. Elijah wasn't there to party. He wasn't there to make friends. He certainly wasn't there to impress anyone. He had one simple job: deliver medication to Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell, the 83-year-old grandmother of the family, who lived in a private guest house at the edge of the property. His grandmother had called him 20 minutes earlier. Mrs. Mitchell's prescription had accidentally been left behind after a church event, and Elijah had volunteered to bring it over. 5 minutes. That was all he planned to stay. Then he would head home. A burst of laughter erupted nearby. Elijah glanced over briefly and immediately recognized the center of attention. Trevor Mitchell stood beside the pool surrounded by half a dozen boys. Tall, athletic, and dressed in a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, Trevor carried himself with the effortless confidence of someone who had never been told no. People laughed before he finished his jokes. They moved when he entered a space. They watched him the way students watched quarterbacks on Friday nights. Trevor's father was the county sheriff. His family owned one of the largest construction companies in the region. Most people admired him. Some feared him. Very few challenged him. Elijah looked away and continued walking. He preferred it that way. The less attention he attracted, the better. A cool breeze moved across the property, carrying the scent of chlorine and freshly cut grass. Somewhere beyond the crowd, fireworks from a nearby baseball game flashed faintly against the horizon. Elijah adjusted the pharmacy bag and headed toward the path leading to the guest house. Then a voice stopped him. "Hey." He kept walking. "I'm talking to you." The second call was louder, sharper. Elijah slowed. Around him, conversations began to fade. Not completely, just enough for people to notice. He turned slightly. Trevor Mitchell was looking directly at him now, one eyebrow raised, one hand casually resting in his pocket. The boys beside him exchanged amused glances. Elijah felt dozens of eyes drifting in his direction. The music still played. The party still moved around them. But something in the atmosphere had changed. Something subtle, like the air before a summer storm. Elijah offered a polite nod. "Evening." A few of Trevor's friends chuckled. Trevor smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had suddenly found a new source of entertainment. Elijah could already feel the attention gathering around him like a spotlight he never asked for. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he had a feeling the next few minutes were about to become much longer than 5. Elijah could feel the attention settling on him from every direction. The laughter around the pool had softened into curious whispers. A few people pulled out their phones, not because anything had happened yet, but because they sensed something might. Trevor took a slow step forward, still smiling. "I do not think I have seen you around before," he said. Elijah adjusted the pharmacy bag in his hand. "That is because I am not here for the party." "Then why are you here?" one of Trevor's friends asked. "Working." A few chuckles followed. Elijah ignored them. "I am dropping something off for your grandmother," he replied calmly. Trevor glanced at the paper bag and laughed. "So you are the delivery guy?" More laughter. Elijah did not react. The silence from him seemed to bother them more than any argument could have. Most people at parties like this either tried too hard to fit in or got angry when embarrassed. Elijah did neither. He simply stood there, steady and composed, as if none of it mattered. Trevor studied him for a moment. Something about Elijah seemed out of place. It was not the hoodie or the worn sneakers. It was the confidence. Not loud confidence. Not arrogant confidence. The quiet kind. The kind that did not need approval. Trevor was not used to that. "You know," Trevor said, folding his arms. "Most people get nervous when everyone is looking at them." Elijah glanced around briefly. Colored lights reflected off the water. Music drifted through the warm air. Dozens of unfamiliar faces watched him. Yet his expression never changed. Maybe they care too much about what other people think. Several students exchanged looks. That answer landed differently than anyone expected. Trevor's smile faded for half a second before returning. You always talk like that. Elijah shrugged. Only when someone asks a question. A few people nearby laughed quietly. Not at Elijah. At Trevor. The shift was small, but noticeable. Trevor felt it immediately. Across the yard, a little girl around 10 years old stepped onto the patio, holding a cup of lemonade. She was Trevor's cousin, Emma. She looked up at Elijah and smiled. You are the one from church, she said. Elijah recognized her instantly. Hey, Emma. You helped me find my dog last month. Elijah nodded. Looks like he is still keeping you busy. Emma grinned. Every day. For the first time since arriving, Elijah smiled. It was brief, genuine, and completely unguarded. Several people noticed. The expression transformed him. Suddenly, he looked less like an outsider and more like someone comfortable in his own skin. Emma pointed toward the guest house near the trees. Great-grandma is awake. She is watching her movie again. Thank you, Elijah said. He started to move past the group. Then Trevor stepped sideways, blocking the path. The smile on Elijah's face disappeared. Not replaced by anger. Just calm attention. Trevor looked around at the crowd gathering nearby. The night air felt heavier now. The music seemed farther away. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled beyond the dark horizon. Trevor tilted his head slightly. Hold on, he said. We are just starting to get to know each other. Elijah stopped walking. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the party continued around them, but the energy had shifted. People were paying attention now. Trevor seemed to enjoy it. Attention was his natural habitat. He thrived on it the way some people thrived on applause. Elijah, on the other hand, looked like he would rather be anywhere else. He glanced once toward the guest house where a warm yellow light glowed through a second-floor window. Mrs. Mitchell was waiting. The medication was still tucked safely beneath his arm. I really should go, Elijah said. Trevor laughed softly. You always this serious? Only when someone is expecting me. Come on, Trevor replied. Relax. It is a party. Elijah looked around. Students filled the patio. Expensive outdoor furniture surrounded the pool. A giant television near the outdoor kitchen played highlights from a football game. Everything about the property reflected wealth and comfort. It was a world many people admired. Yet Elijah did not seem impressed by any of it. Trevor noticed. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Most people reacted when they saw the Mitchell estate. They complimented it, asked questions, tried to fit in. Elijah did none of those things. He acted as though the mansion was just another house. You know who I am, right? Trevor asked. Elijah nodded once. I know your name. That is it. Trevor asked. Should there be more? A few students nearby exchanged glances. Trevor forced a smile. The answer sounded innocent, but somehow it felt like a challenge. Not because Elijah was trying to challenge him. Because he was not. He simply did not seem interested in status. Trevor had spent most of his life surrounded by people who measured worth through money, popularity, and influence. Elijah appeared to measure it differently. Across the patio, Emma quietly walked away toward the guest house. The little girl glanced back once, sensing the tension. Elijah noticed too. He wondered if he should leave immediately. Experience had taught him that certain situations only became more complicated the longer they lasted. Trevor folded his arms. You go to East Ridge? Elijah nodded. Graduated last month. Football? Trevor asked. No, basketball. No, then what exactly do you do? Elijah thought for a moment. I work. Help my grandmother. Try to stay out of trouble. Several people chuckled. Not because the answer was funny, but because it sounded so different from what they expected. Trevor stared at him. Most teenagers his age talked about sports, parties, social media, or college plans. Elijah sounded older somehow. More grounded. That is it? Trevor asked. Pretty much. A breeze moved through the trees beyond the fence. The smell of rain drifted into the air. Dark clouds had begun gathering above the distant horizon. Trevor's friends shifted uneasily, sensing that the conversation was not unfolding the way they expected. They had assumed Elijah would become nervous or defensive. Instead, he remained calm, steady, patient. The more composed he seemed, the more Trevor felt compelled to push. Somewhere deep down, Trevor wanted a reaction. Any reaction. Anger, fear, frustration, Something. But Elijah offered none of it. He simply stood there beneath the party lights with the same quiet expression. And for the first time that night, Trevor began to feel as though he was not the one controlling the moment anymore. Trevor took another step forward, and several of his friends instinctively spread out behind him. It was subtle, but deliberate. The path leading toward the guest house was no longer completely open. Elijah noticed. He also noticed the way a few students had begun drifting closer, drawn by curiosity. The crowd was growing. The party had found its entertainment. Trevor smiled as if everything were friendly, but there was something sharp underneath it now. "You know," he said, "most people would be grateful to get invited here." Elijah glanced toward the mansion. Light poured from the enormous windows. Music pulsed through the walls. Expensive. Decorations covered every corner of the property. "Maybe," he replied, "but I was not invited." Trevor laughed. "Exactly." A few of his friends joined in. Elijah remained calm. The paper pharmacy bag rested securely beneath his arm. He could almost hear his grandmother's voice reminding him to stay patient. Stay respectful. Do not let other people choose your behavior for you. Those lessons had carried him through difficult years. They had become part of him. Across the patio, a sudden commotion broke out near one of the drink tables. A younger teenager accidentally bumped into another student while carrying a tray of sodas. Several cups tipped over. Ice scattered across the stone surface. One cup splashed onto Trevor's expensive white shirt. The music continued, but nearby conversations immediately stopped. The younger boy froze. He could not have been older than 15. Thin, nervous, clearly embarrassed. "I am sorry," the teenager said quickly. "I did not mean to." Trevor looked down at the stain forming across his sleeve. The smile disappeared from his face. The boy's hands trembled. "I said I am sorry." Trevor started walking toward him. Several students exchanged uneasy looks. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Moments like this had happened before. People knew better than to get involved. Elijah watched the teenager's expression. Fear, embarrassment, isolation. He recognized it instantly. He had worn that same expression himself years ago. The boy took a step backward. Trevor kept approaching. The distance between them slowly disappeared. Then Elijah moved. Not quickly, not dramatically. He simply stepped between them. The motion was so calm that it took everyone a second to process it. Trevor stopped. The teenager stared in disbelief. Elijah looked at the younger boy first. "It was an accident," he said. "Go help clean it up." The teenager hesitated before nodding. He hurried away. Silence settled across the patio. Trevor stared directly at Elijah. "Did you just step into my conversation?" Elijah met his gaze. "I stepped into a situation that did not need to become a problem." Several people exchanged nervous glances. Nobody expected that answer. Trevor folded his arms. The colored lights from the pool reflected across the water behind him. "You seem to have a habit of telling people what they should do." Elijah shook his head. "Not really." "Then why get involved?" Trevor asked. Elijah's voice remained calm. "Because sometimes somebody should." The words hung in the warm summer air. No shouting. No insults. No threats. Just a simple sentence. Yet somehow it landed harder than anything else said that night. Around them, the crowd grew completely silent. And for the first time since Elijah had entered the property, Trevor's expression revealed something new. It was not amusement. It was irritation. The irritation on Trevor's face lingered for only a second before he forced another smile. It was the kind of smile people used when they wanted everyone else to believe they were still in control. Around the pool, students shifted uneasily. The atmosphere no longer felt like a party. It felt like something else entirely. Elijah could sense it in the silence. He could hear it in the way conversations had stopped across the patio. Even the music seemed distant now, buried beneath the weight of dozens of watchful eyes. Trevor took a slow breath. "You really think you are some kind of hero?" he asked. Elijah shook his head. "No, then why keep stepping in?" Trevor replied. "Because it is the right thing to do." The answer came without hesitation. No anger. No attitude. Just certainty. Trevor looked away briefly, almost as if he regretted asking the question. Several of his friends exchanged glances. They had expected an argument. Instead, they were watching something far more uncomfortable. The more Trevor pushed, the calmer Elijah became. The contrast was impossible to ignore. A light breeze swept across the water. The surface of the pool rippled beneath the colorful reflections of the party lights. Above them, dark clouds continued gathering beyond the tree line. The first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the night sky. Elijah glanced again toward the guest house. He was already running late. Mrs. Mitchell was waiting. His grandmother was probably wondering why such a simple delivery was taking so long. He adjusted the pharmacy bag and took a small step toward the path. Trevor immediately moved sideways again. Not aggressively, just enough to block the route once more. Several people noticed. The crowd grew even quieter. Elijah stopped. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Trevor leaned slightly closer. "You know what your problem is?" he asked. Elijah remained silent. "You walk around acting like you are better than everyone." A few students looked surprised by the accusation. Elijah looked surprised too. Not offended, just genuinely confused. "I do not think that," he said. "Really?" Trevor replied. "Because you keep looking at everybody like none of this matters." Elijah glanced around the property. The giant house, the luxury cars, the expensive decorations, the crowd. Then he looked back at Trevor. "It does not matter." A stunned silence followed. Trevor blinked. Several students stared at Elijah. One girl near the pool actually lowered her phone. Nobody had expected that answer. Elijah continued calmly. "Not the cars. Not the house. Not who is popular. None of that tells me who somebody is." The words settled over the crowd like falling rain. No speech. No performance. Just honesty. Trevor's expression hardened. For the first time all night, he looked uncertain. Elijah could see it. Not fear. Not weakness. Something closer to doubt. The kind that appears when a person hears a truth they were not prepared for. The thunder sounded again, slightly closer now. A cool drop of rain landed on the stone patio. Then another. Nobody moved. Nobody left. The storm was approaching. And somehow everyone sensed that something much bigger than the weather was about to arrive with it. Another raindrop landed on Elijah's sleeve. Then another. Within seconds, a soft drizzle began falling across the property, turning the colorful lights around the pool into shimmering reflections on the wet stone patio. Still, nobody moved. The crowd remained frozen in place, caught between curiosity and uncertainty. Elijah stood quietly beneath the darkening sky, the paper pharmacy bag still tucked beneath his arm. The rain dampened the shoulders of his hoodie, but he did not seem to notice. Trevor stared at him from only a few feet away. The confidence that had carried him through most of the evening was beginning to crack around the edges. Not because Elijah had threatened him. Not because he had raised his voice. If anything, the opposite was true. The calmer Elijah remained, the more uncomfortable Trevor became. A distant flash of lightning briefly illuminated the trees beyond the estate. For an instant, the entire backyard appeared silver. Then darkness returned. Elijah lowered his eyes toward the wet stone beneath his feet. The sound of rain tapping against the pool surface created a steady rhythm. It reminded him of another night years earlier. Another storm. Another crowd. Another moment he wished he could forget. The memory surfaced without warning. Bright arena lights. Thousands of spectators. The smell of sweat and canvas. The deafening roar of people cheering for conflict they would never have to carry home with them. Elijah remembered standing under those lights as a teenager. He remembered the pressure, the expectations, the constant demand to prove himself, to be tougher, stronger, harder. Every victory brought more attention. Every success invited another challenge. And eventually he had grown tired of all of it. People admired strength, but very few understood its cost. His grandmother had. She was the one who sat beside him afterward and reminded him that real character was not measured by what a person could do. It was measured by what they chose not to do. The lesson had stayed with him ever since. Rainwater slid from the edge of his hood. He slowly exhaled. Around him, conversations remained silent. Several students shifted uncomfortably beneath the weather, but nobody wanted to leave. They sensed something important was happening, even if they could not fully explain it. Trevor glanced around at the crowd. For perhaps the first time in his life, he realized that he no longer had their complete attention. They were not watching him. They were watching Elijah. Watching the young man who stood perfectly still while everyone else seemed unsettled. Watching the person who had nothing to gain and yet refused to compromise who he was. The realization bothered Trevor more than the rain. Elijah finally looked back toward the guest house. A warm light still glowed through the upstairs window. Mrs. Mitchell was waiting. The simple purpose that had brought him there had never changed. He adjusted the pharmacy bag slightly and took a slow breath. The storm above continued building. The storm around him had not yet reached its peak. But deep down, Elijah could feel it approaching. And this time, he was not worried about the weather. The rain came down a little harder now, scattering tiny circles across the surface of the pool. Students began pulling jackets over their heads, but very few actually left. Something invisible held them there. Trevor felt it. Elijah felt it. The entire crowd felt it. The night had become bigger than a party. A sudden voice broke through the silence. Elijah. Everyone turned. Standing beneath the covered patio near the guest house was an elderly woman wrapped in a light blue cardigan. Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell. Her silver hair framed a warm face marked by time and kindness. The moment she saw Elijah, her expression brightened. There you are, she called. I was starting to worry. The crowd looked from her to Elijah and back again. Elijah immediately stepped forward. I am sorry, ma'am. I got delayed. Mrs. Mitchell smiled. You always apologize for things that are not your fault. Several students exchanged surprised looks. Trevor remained silent. Elijah walked toward her and carefully handed over the pharmacy bag. Mrs. Mitchell accepted it with both hands. Thank you, sweetheart, she said. You saved me another trip tomorrow. Happy to help. Her eyes moved across the gathering crowd. She noticed the tension immediately. Decades of life experience had taught her how to read a room. What is going on here? She asked. Nobody answered. Trevor looked away. For the first time that evening, he appeared uncertain of what to say. Mrs. Mitchell glanced at Elijah. Were these young people giving you trouble? Elijah shook his head gently. Nothing I cannot handle. The answer was simple, honest, but something about it made several students lower their eyes. Mrs. Mitchell studied him for a moment before nodding. That sounds like you. Then she turned toward the crowd. Do any of you know who this young man is? Silence. One student shrugged. Another shook his head. Trevor folded his arms, but said nothing. Mrs. Mitchell smiled softly. That does not surprise me. Rain tapped against the patio roof overhead. The old woman looked back at Elijah with unmistakable affection. 3 years ago, when I fell in the church parking lot during a thunderstorm, most people drove right past. Several students looked surprised. Elijah stopped. More silence followed. He sat with me in the rain until the ambulance arrived. He missed an important event because he refused to leave an old woman alone. A few students exchanged glances. Mrs. Mitchell continued. Last winter, he spent every Saturday helping veterans repair storm damage to their homes. The crowd grew quieter. And when our youth center almost closed, he organized volunteers to keep it open. Trevor's expression slowly changed. Confusion replaced confidence. The picture forming in front of him was nothing like the assumptions he had made. Mrs. Mitchell looked directly at the students surrounding the pool. The world spends too much time judging people by appearances. Her voice remained gentle. If you want to know someone's character, look at how they treat people who can do nothing for them in return. Nobody spoke. Nobody laughed. The rain continued falling steadily across the estate. Elijah stood quietly beside the elderly woman, uncomfortable with the attention. He had never done those things for recognition. Yet as the crowd stared at him, something shifted. Not in Elijah, in everyone else. For the first time all night, they were beginning to see him clearly. The rain softened into a steady curtain of silver, washing across the estate and muting the distant music. Nobody seemed interested in the party anymore. The crowd remained gathered beneath covered areas around the patio, watching a scene that had become far more meaningful than anything they had expected when the night began. Elijah shifted uncomfortably as the attention settled on him. Recognition had never been something he chased. In fact, he spent most of his life avoiding it. Mrs. Mitchell seemed to understand that immediately. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Do not worry, she said quietly. I am finished embarrassing you. A few students laughed softly. Even Elijah smiled. The tension that had dominated the evening began to loosen. Trevor stood several feet away, staring at the wet stone beneath his shoes. For the first time all night, he did not have a response. The confident remarks were gone. The jokes were gone. Even his friends seemed unsure what to say. One of them finally broke the silence. Wait, he said, looking at Elijah. You really helped all those people? Elijah shrugged. A lot of people helped. But you were part of it? The boy asked. Elijah nodded once. Another student spoke up. Why? The question hung in the air. Elijah thought about it for a moment. Because people needed help. The simplicity of the answer caught everyone off guard. There was no speech. No attempt to sound impressive. Just the truth. A young woman standing near the pool shook her head in disbelief. Most people would tell everyone about that. Elijah looked toward the rain-covered yard. Then they are probably doing it for the wrong reason. The words landed softly, but their effect was immediate. Several students looked away. Others lowered their eyes. The statement was not judgmental. If anything, it was thoughtful. Honest. Trevor finally looked up. His expression had changed completely. The arrogance that had defined him earlier seemed smaller now. Less certain. He glanced around at the crowd and saw something he had not expected. Nobody was impressed by wealth anymore. Nobody cared about popularity. For the first time, the person everyone respected most was the quiet young man standing beside an elderly woman in the rain. Trevor swallowed hard. "I made some assumptions," he said. The admission surprised everyone. Elijah looked at him, but said nothing. Trevor rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "I thought I knew what kind of person you were." The rain continued tapping against the patio roof. "Looks like I was wrong." Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that appears when someone is trying to be sincere. Elijah studied Trevor for a moment. Then he nodded once. "It happens." No lecture. No humiliation. No attempt to make Trevor feel worse. Just 3 simple words. Mrs. Mitchell smiled quietly. Several students exchanged surprised looks. They had expected resentment. Instead, they were watching forgiveness. And somehow that carried more weight than any argument ever could. The storm above the estate continued drifting across the night sky, but beneath it something had changed. The crowd was no longer divided between winners and losers, popular students and outsiders. For a brief moment, they were simply people learning an important lesson together. The rain began to ease as quietly as it had arrived. What had started as a storm was now little more than a soft mist drifting across the estate. The party lights reflected off the wet pavement like scattered stars. One by one, conversations slowly returned, but they sounded different now. Quieter. More thoughtful. Elijah glanced at the time on his phone and smiled faintly. He had planned to stay 5 minutes. Nearly an hour had passed. Mrs. Mitchell shook her head with amusement. "Your grandmother is probably wondering where you disappeared to." Elijah laughed softly. "She definitely is." The elderly woman patted his arm. "Then do not keep her waiting." He nodded. Around them, students stepped aside without being asked. The path that had once been blocked now stood completely open. Nobody seemed eager to stand in his way anymore. Trevor watched in silence as Elijah prepared to leave. The confidence that usually defined him had been replaced by something far more valuable. Reflection. After a moment, he walked forward. Several students looked up, curious about what he might say. Trevor stopped a few feet away. Rainwater still clung to his sleeves. "Hey," he said. Elijah turned. For a second, Trevor struggled to find the words. Then he simply told the truth. "I was wrong about you." The crowd grew quiet again. Elijah studied him briefly before offering a small smile. "Thank you." That was all. No victory speech. No attempt to embarrass him. No desire to settle a score. Trevor lowered his eyes and nodded. Somehow that simple response made the apology feel real. Across the patio, Emma waved enthusiastically. "Bye, Elijah." He waved back. "See you Sunday." The little girl grinned. Several students smiled as well. The atmosphere felt lighter now. Warmer. Like something heavy had finally lifted from the evening. Elijah adjusted his hoodie and started toward the driveway. The wet gravel crunched beneath his shoes. Behind him, the music resumed. The party continued, but it no longer felt important. As he reached the gate, he glanced back once. Trevor stood near the pool speaking quietly with the younger teenager from earlier. Mrs. Mitchell sat beneath the covered patio, smiling to herself. Groups of students talked in small circles, many of them looking thoughtful rather than entertained. Elijah nodded slightly and turned away. The cool night air carried the scent of rain and fresh grass. Beyond the estate, the road stretched into darkness, illuminated only by scattered streetlights and the distant glow of town. He walked calmly beneath the clearing sky, hands in his pockets, heading home. No crowd followed him. No applause echoed behind him. The night ended the same way it began, quietly. Yet somewhere inside the people he left behind, something had changed. They had spent the evening looking at appearances, status, popularity, and assumptions. In the end, none of those things mattered. What remained was character. And as the clouds slowly parted above North Carolina, the last traces of rain disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a silence that felt remarkably like peace.